All right, well, Jim, thank you for doing this for us. This is one in a series of these interviews we're doing with a grant from the American College of Trial Lawyers, and we appreciate you spending the afternoon with us.
Thanks for including me.
Well, the only thing I want to make sure that I say is that before we start, that this is about you. We want to hear about your life, about your career. I don't feel a real need to say this, but I will anyway. Don't be bashful about telling stories about your career and your life. The only place really to start is at the beginning. You grew up in Atlanta.
Grew up in Atlanta.
And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what Atlanta was like back then and what it was like to grow up in Atlanta. And while you're doing it, I want you to talk a little bit about your parents.
All right. Atlanta was a very different place at that point. Parents both had grown up in rural areas of Georgia. My father in Henry County and mother in Morgan County, or as it's correctly pronounced, Morgan. Father went to a place called Berry in Rome, Georgia, which is just an amazing, amazing place, because keep in mind this is in the Depression. His father was a newspaper editor and school teacher with 8 children, and I've never been able to figure out how you could send somebody off to school, except of course at Rome at that point. The students actually worked on the farm to help pay for it. They had met in Atlanta and gotten married. We lived in the DeKalb section of Atlanta. As you may know, Atlanta covers 2 counties. Went from kindergarten to the 7th grade at East Lake Elementary School, and from the 8th grade through the 12th grade to Murphy High School. It was really very different in the sense that when you were 10 or 12, you and your buddies would get on the bus, the Atlanta transit system, this predates MARTA, and you'd go downtown. And you'd spend the afternoon going to the movie and going to the Crystal for 5-cent hamburgers. The idea now of someone putting 10 or 12-year-olds on public transportation and sending them downtown would probably not be the same reaction.
It's a different city.
Very different city. In fact, at the Darlington Apartments, I'm sure you've seen it, they had that population sign. That thing has been there forever. But I can remember when it hit 500,000 people in Atlanta. And I mean, there were TV stories, there were newspaper stories. It just can't get any bigger. And last time I went by there a week or so ago, I think it's 6.5 million. Oh, gosh. Very different place.
I know from our conversations that your father had an enormous influence on you and your life and the way you've lived your life. Could you talk a little bit about him and how he influenced you?
Well, one of the things I think that's certainly had the biggest impact on me, or one of the biggest impacts on me, is that as I was growing up, I heard from him very regularly that you make decisions about other people, not on superficial things, but on their character, what's inside. I heard that a long time before I heard it from M.L. King Jr. For him, I don't think that was a political statement so much as it was a religious thing. They were fairly religious. They were Baptist, and he believed that you did not judge people by superficial things like color or how much money somebody made or whatever. You judged them by what was inside. And so that was a lesson I learned and kept and hopefully adhered to for a long time afterwards.
Probably a fairly unusual set of beliefs for his time and place.
Well, probably so, yeah. Because keep in mind, this would be in the late 40s, early 50s. Jim Crow was still alive and well. Things were very different. In fact, just one or two little things. I used to spend summers in Rutledge, Georgia. which is between Atlanta and Madison. And one of my friends there was the son of a woman who worked in the house, and his father worked in the fields. And one day we were going into Rutledge, and I wanted to get an ice cream cone. And so I started to the pharmacy, and he stopped. And he said, "I've got to go around the back." And I don't know, I'm maybe, 12 years old. And I was totally taken aback and was just, totally insensitive also, asking him, "Why are you going around in the back? We just go in the front door." And of course, at that time, he had to go to the back door to he could get an ice cream cone, but he had to get it out of the back door. And the other thing that relates back, by the way, to my dad, I am the only person who almost got his family excommunicated from a Baptist church. You probably think that's impossible. Fortunately, it was, but he came close.
I'm not sure the Baptists excommunicate people.
Well, no, but they were trying to figure out how the hell to get rid of us.
So to speak.
Because they had this thing called youth ministry. So on Sunday nights, and keep in mind, at this particular point in my life, church attendance meant not only Wednesday night prayer meeting, but Sunday school, church at 11, BTU, and church at night. So, I mean, this is serious stuff. In any event, sometime I had been asked to do the youth minister role on one night, and I did my little bit. And at the end of it, I said, "But I've got a real question. That in Sunday school, we sing a song, red and yellow, black and white. They are precious in His sight. And then after church, the Board of Deacons sits around meeting to decide what to do if a black person were to come and want to enter God's house." And believe it or not, the reaction was something else, something I, of course, didn't anticipate. But there were two kinds of phone calls to my parents. Ones were the sympathetic ones. "Oh, we feel so sorry for you to have a child like that." The others were sometimes really vicious about how you need to get out of this church. We don't need people like you here. And that was, I think, those were some of the first occasions I had to see that maybe everybody wasn't treated the same.
But for you, it was an honest question.
Oh yeah, I was serious. I couldn't understand it. It seemed totally hypocritical to sing the song in the morning and then have an afternoon meeting to exclude people.
Which could be because it was completely hypocritical.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so you're growing up in Atlanta, and there comes a time when you have to think about going to college.
Right.
Now, I guess it's well over 50 years that in one way or another, you have been affiliated with Emory University.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure it couldn't possibly be that long. It's just been since '59.
As a student, alum, faculty member, and so on.
No, how that came about was, just like everybody else, I had applied to a number of schools, and for my parents, it was really a concern. How are we going to be able to afford to send this kid off, particularly to a private school? And my high school counselor had kept saying to me, "Don't say no to Emory." And I had no idea why he was saying this. But, he had never given me bad advice, so I had not said no to Emory, even though I was really thinking about going someplace else. And I got this nice letter from a guy named Charles Watkins, who was the Dean of Admissions. And he asked me if I'd like to come to lunch. And I just thought that was really nice. So I put on my one suit, and I went over to Emory for lunch. And it turns out it was not only Charlie Watkins, but the chancellor and the provost and the president. And we just had this delightful lunch. So I come back, and being as naive as I was, I tell my mother, "I don't understand. How could these guys have enough time to have lunch with every prospective student. And I just thought this was wonderful. Well, I send my handwritten thank you note back, of course.
You were raised right.
A good Southern boy knew what to do. And unfortunately crossed in the mail with a letter from Charlie Watkins saying, we hope you'll decide to come to Emory, and if you do, we have a scholarship that will pay full tuition and another 2/3 of tuition to cover your room, board, books, and whatever. Needless to say, that ended the college search. I still laughed at it. I think my mother cried for about 3 days after the receipt of that letter. They were so relieved. So I showed up as a 17-year-old freshman in 1959 at Emory University.
Well, talk a little bit about your time there as an undergraduate. We're going to talk about law school in a minute, but as an undergraduate, were there any classmates or professors or experiences? I know you were big in your fraternity. I mean, that you look back on now and you think that was important to who I became?
Yeah, like everyone at that time who came to Emory, you went through Rush, and it was an unusual year in that my pledge class had 62 people in it, which was, I think, about the size the fraternity was before these 62 people got there, so it was very big. Some of the people who were classmates then will be coming to see Phyllis and me on the 12th of May for our 50th reunion, and I'm looking forward to seeing lots of them. Some of the profs, a guy named Jack Boozer, who was in the religion department, R.A. Day, who was in the chemistry department, Bell Wiley, who had written 2 books on the Civil War. I'm a real history buff, so loved taking those courses. But it was an interesting time.
Well, I know that law was not your first career choice. You actually went through some other possibilities, maybe all the other possibilities.
Well, no, just actually 2 permutations. Believe it or not, I was a physics major.
Really?
And that lasted a whole year. And what happened was that during spring, it was a quarter system. And during spring quarter, I'm in the basement of the physics building doing physics experiments, with pendulums and all sorts of stuff. And it occurs to me, all my friends are probably up on the quadrangle sitting under trees reading poetry with their girlfriends. And that seemed to be just a whole bunch better than being in the basement of the physics building. So I had to change majors and decided, okay, well, what about economics? Because that's practical, right? So I became an econ major, and the mentor there was Professor Aronoff, whose nickname, not to his face, but his nickname was Jumping Joe. And the reason it was Jumping Joe Aronoff is because he wrote with his right hand and erased with his left hand, and that was how your classes went. He was also very helpful in getting me into graduate school at a little correspondence school on the Charles River in Cambridge, since he was a triple Harvard. But the thing I really remember about Jumping Joe was I had him for a reading course my senior year. And he would give me like 1,000 pages a week to read. Needless to say, I would not read them all. And
Don't say that in front of the students,
Well, they've already picked it up, I suspect, by this time. But I learned very quickly is that when I got to the end of whatever I had read, I would say, Dr. Aronoff, let me just ask you this. And I would ask him some question, and he would leap up and grab his chalk and his eraser, and for the rest of that period, he would just go off on whatever it was I asked him, and then he would look at his watch and say, oh my gosh, we've run out of time, I didn't even get to ask you out. I said, that's fine, we'll. So then I'd get a new assignment, and we would play the same thing the next week. So the law became sort of the third permutation, and that was I had worked in the summers out at Lockheed in the senior economist office, and it finally occurred to me that if I went to Boston and spent 5 years there, I would become an economist. And all of a sudden that began saying, a little scary. And so you look through, right? Med school was out because I'd not had organic. Dental school I wasn't real interested in. Foolishly, I thought business school was too practical. It took me 20 years or so to learn that wasn't the case. Theology school might not have been a good mix. And so now we are down to law school.
So the profession of last resort.
Yeah, you know, I'd love to be able to say that I thought from the time I was 5 years old I always wanted to be a lawyer. Well, it didn't work quite that way. So I'd made an appointment with the then Dean Ben Johnson. Walked across the quad, go in. It's a nice man. Chats with me for a minute, and he says, what were your LSATs? I said, well, Dean, I haven't taken the LSATs. And he leans back in his chair, and he says, now let me get this straight. This is April, and you want to be here in September as a law student, and you haven't even taken the LSATs. And I thought, well, maybe the interview is not going quite as well as I was hoping. And I said, well, that's true. And he said, well, what did you make on your GREs? And I told him that. And he said, just as I'm sure would happen at admissions decisions now, said, all right, make you a deal. You're in for September if you'll take the LSATs between now and the time classes start.
That would not happen today.
Oh, you don't think that would happen?
No.
Okay. So that's how I ended up going to law school. Fortunately, nobody had told me that I was supposed to be miserable. So I thoroughly enjoyed 3 years of law school.
Well, you missed that lesson too.
Yep, missed that lesson too.
Well, I want you to talk about your time at Emory Law School, and particularly about any of the professors that had an effect on you, and what it was like to be in law school back then.
Well, actually, there were several professors that had an impact, and the difference was, believe it or not, just like your students, we often wore jackets and ties to class.
Don't let today fool you.
Actually carried briefcases, not backpacks. This was, of course, 4 decades before we could walk the halls texting. So, again, a very different time. Very nice in the sense that at Emory at that point the class was actually slightly smaller than your classes here. It was great size. So that you had a lot of interaction with faculty. You got to know them well. There was one in particular, a guy named Bill Ferguson, who got the nickname of Wild Bill. Had been an assistant attorney general in New York before he came down to Emory to teach. And he was assigned to do orientation. And what he'd done is given us a case to read. We're going to brief a case. Of course, we don't have a clue what briefing a case means. So we go through there, and we all show up in class the next day. And in walks Bill, carrying a stainless steel 3-foot ruler. I'm curious what he's doing with that. But in any event, he comes in. And he looks around and he says, Mr. Longan, tell me about this case. And of course, Mr. Longan was rather nervous, but was told to stand up and to begin reciting. And Mr. Longan got about 2 minutes max, maybe a minute into the case, and all of a sudden that yardstick comes down on the desktop. Bam! And he's screaming each time he hits it, no, no, no. This is first day in orientation, right? You're looking around and all these people thinking, ooh, medical school's looking a whole bunch better right now.
Even dental school.
Yeah, at that point they're trying to figure out how can I pack my bag and get out of here. Well, he was sort of the old stereotype of a law prof. in that he was tough as nails. He would call on you in class, and he would not stop. You know, if you gave an answer, that's fine, but he would keep changing the facts just a little bit and moving until you finally were either totally confused or stymied or whatever. And then he would just very dismissively tell you to sit down. So much so that, by the way, at anniversaries or reunions 25 years later, people would say that just his name would cause their stomach to start turning over.
I see why they called him Wild Bill.
Oh, yeah. But two funny things that had happened. One day in class, in the middle of winter, I get called on. And I know I'm going to have scar tissue. You know, that's just what happened. And as a total shock to you, there have been isolated instances in my life where I've been a smartass.
Secret's out, Jim.
Secret's out. I fear I'll take my shot.
Okay.
So I took my shot. And Wild Bill is in my face for the rest of the class. At the end of class, he sticks his finger in my chest and says, "You stay here." You know, normally it takes class 5 minutes for everybody to pack up and leave, right? 3 nanoseconds left. That room was vacant. Everybody was out of there. The door closes. Bill steps back, breaks into a big grin, says, "You want to get a beer?" And from that point on, he and I were actually great good friends. Now, he still called on me in every class I took. He still tried to make sure the scar tissue continued. Mm-hmm. But even when, this is so long ago that your students won't even understand the game, it's not a video game. It's called bridge. And that we would play bridge down in the basement of the law school, and the faculty would come down. You know, this is lunch, and everybody would come down and play. And I would make comments like when he would do something less than professional at the table, you know, taking a bad finesse, whatever. And I would be inclined to say things like, "Professor Ferguson, you know, I would not leave my day job." You know. And even the other faculty members there would laugh, and you'd see this little twitch come up. In fact, when I came back on the faculty, one of the funny things, several funny things. One, Bill came in the first day and he said, "Well, just want you to know, I went back and looked at all my grade books." I mean, who would keep grade books that long? Since this was 30 years, by the way. He said, "Just check to see what you did." And I assume it was okay, because that was the end of the conversation. Mm-hmm. But young faculty thought he and I did not get along very well, because he would stand in my door, and you could hear him up and down the hallways. And you will probably have to edit this, in that he would say, "You son of a bitch." Now, what the lead-in for that would have been was that Bill was somewhat conservative politically, and I would have sent him something from the ACLU or the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights or something. Not with any idea I was going to change his political views, but just to pull his chain.
He pulled yours long enough.
Oh, yeah, well, and he would get me later on. He would send me something, and I would go stand in his door and make comments. So the young faculty just thought we hated each other, and it turned out we were really great good friends, to the point that I was the executor in his estate, which if you've ever been an executor, you know that's not a gift, but it was.
May have been his final vengeance.
It was. If you only knew. I'm not even going to tell you some of those stories.
Well, after law school, of course, this being the mid-'60s, Vietnam is going on, and virtually everybody ends up in military service.
Yeah.
And you did too.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about your military service and what effect, if any, that had on you later in life.
Well, I don't know that you even know this, but I won the lottery my 3rd year in law school. Now,
I'll bite. What do you mean?
This was not the one with the Hope Scholarship. This was run by the Department of Defense. And if you had a winning number, you got 13 months, all expenses paid, to South Vietnam. It didn't look like just what I'd planned on doing immediately after graduating from law school. And particularly when I'd gone through for my physical and thought I was so smart, I'd taken my contact lens out. And so when the guy says, read the chart, and I legitimately said, I can't see the chart. And he said, you pass. I thought, this is a bad sign. It's just not looking good. So I applied to the Georgia Air National Guard, which, as you know, is similar to the Navy SEALs, but not exactly the same. There were 600 applicants. There were 6 slots available. And I can honestly tell you that I got one of the 6 on sheer merit. And the reason I know that, my uncle, the adjutant general, called to tell me that I got one of the 6. And I have no apologies for that, not at all. I won't take time to tell you all about basic training and other things, but it was interesting that out of those 6 folks, let's see, you may have heard some of their names. John Isaacson was one, Mike Bowers was one, Bill Ide, who became president of the American Bar Association, was one. It was an interesting group, but we protected Dobbins. The Viet Cong did not get on Dobbins Air Force Base for the entire 6 years we were there. I mean, we were a tough group. And what did I learn from that? It was that I did not want to make a career in the military.
I think you knew that going in.
Yeah, I knew that going in, but it was to the great chagrin, by the way, that my uncle was very upset when at the end of my 6 years I didn't re-up.
Yeah. Well, when your active duty ends, right, you begin your law practice with a firm then known as
Alston, Miller and Gaines.
Alston, Miller and Gaines, okay. And
it's a huge firm. I was 24th.
Well, I was going to say, how big was it then?
And 24 lawyers.
And how big is it now?
I don't know, 800, something like that.
So
A whole bunch bigger.
Tell us about the firm when you joined it and the people that were there. I mean, it was a different time. It was a different kind of place. What was it like when you walked in the door that first day?
Well, again, simply because of the fact that it was so much smaller. And as a young associate, what you loved was if Philip Alston or Alec Gaines would stick their head in at 11:45 and say, "Let's get a bowl of soup," because you knew that a bowl of soup meant walking across the street to the Commerce Club for lunch. Great amount of interplay between or among lawyers, senior, mid-range, whatever. Bright group of folks. There were, out of the 24, 5 were Rhodes Scholars. So, I mean, it was smart folks. At that time, we had just begun to keep time slips. You don't even remember a time prior to time slips. And of course, senior partners were having a real difficult time adjusting to this anyway, because they were used to sending out a bill that simply said, for professional services rendered X dollars.
I've got to ask, how do you determine then
What
how
was
much to
fair.
bill? What was fair?
What was fair to the client. Didn't matter how much time you would put in, it was what's fair to the client. What
For
was the
services
result?
rendered.
Exactly. What was the result you got? So, we did start keeping time. Something happened in my first year that at the time, almost scared me to death, but I doubt would happen now. And that was on a Saturday morning. One of the senior partners pops his head in and says, "Jim, the Partners Committee is concerned about you." The Partners Committee was the management. There were 6 of them on there, but you learned very quickly that of the 6, whatever Philip Alston or Alec Gaines decided, that was what the decision was. But in any event, they said, "We're really concerned about you." And I thought, oh my God, what could I have screwed up on in this short period of time? He said, "You work too hard. This is Saturday afternoon. We do not want to see you in here on a Saturday afternoon, and certainly not a Sunday. you need to go home. Now, I expect if a partner in a large firm now were to say that to an associate, that the partner would be shifted off to a funny farm someplace. Other differences. When you came up for partner, you know what the first question was? Not how many billable hours did she have? What does this person do in the community?
Really?
And that was a dead serious question. They wanted to know what you did in the community. And it could be any number of different things. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not that you must do this, but that you were active in the community. And that had a major impact on some things I was able to do.
Yeah. Whereas today it might be, how many clients will we lose if we don't make them partners?
Mm-hmm. Or did you really have 2,400 billable hours? Right. Yeah. It's just a different world. There was less pressure on income, in part because partners in most of the major firms were generally fairly well fixed economically anyway. I mean, Henry Miller was the largest single shareholder in a little bank called C&S. So, you know, annual income was not a major issue. And just to put that in perspective, by the way, a named partner in a large Atlanta firm in the late 60s was probably making $45,000. Adjust that for inflation, and it would be $350,000, $400,000 now. The real fact is $1.8 million, $2.2 million. You don't change income streams that way without changing the character of the practices.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that was today sounds quaint about, I'm sorry, but it does, about the way...
I'm normally referred to as quaint. So
I wasn't talking about you.
Oh, okay.
The practice at a firm like that is you entered as a new associate of rotating from one practice area to another. Tell us about that and what value you saw in it. They don't do it anymore, but...
Well, there were 6 departments, and you were going to spend 6 months in each of the 6 departments. And at the end of the time, you were supposed to find yourself, you know, where you wanted to be. New associates are generally not asked to find themselves. They are offered, do you want the M&A slot in the corporate department? But when I got there, again, since you're not keeping time slips, you might as well rotate associates, right? So I started off in litigation. And as the new kid on the block, there were actually 9 of us, which was such a huge class at that point. But I was assigned the outlying counties, DeKalb, Cobb, and you'd go to those for non-jury hearings. And it was actually a great training to begin with. The ones I liked, by the way, I loved to go to Cobb County, because the 2 judges there were Albert Henderson, who ultimately became a federal district court judge, and Conley Ingram, who went on the Georgia Supreme Court and was then a law partner for a number of years. But the way they conducted non-jury hearings was not in the courtroom. You'd go in the judge's chambers, and he had a desk and a conference table teed to the desk, and the lawyers would sit on either side and sip coffee and make their arguments, and the judge would make a ruling, and you would chat a little bit, and very, very civil. Fulton County was a little bit different from that. But one of the things I'd already recognized during that first rotation was that maybe litigation wasn't the right place for me.
Why?
Well,
how could you tell?
It was clear, and you know, I was learning to do it pretty well, that what you were doing is trying to find out who did something wrong and spin that and point it out. And you very quickly got to the point, I want to win, which means you got to lose. And in all candor, that just didn't fit me nearly as well. I loved the transactional end when I got there, because it was very possible to have win-win situations. A deal gets put together and both sides are really happy about it. And I think I was better at that, and I certainly enjoyed it more. But second rotation was in real estate, which was the last place. You know, certainly I'm not going to be in real estate. I'd taken a lot of tax courses. What am I going to be doing in real estate? But right after I got with the firm, 2 senior partners in the real estate department left to form their own firm. And about a year later, the next 2 in seniority left to form their own firm. So all of a sudden, you know, I'm in the rotation in the real estate department and about the 5th or 6th person in seniority all of a sudden. And was finding that it was actually a lot more fun. They moved a department head in from the corporate department who really wanted to run the corporate department, not the real estate department. One of the Rhodes Scholars, by the way. And so he sort of latched on to this young associate that he would just work the hell out of him, which he did, and I learned tons of things. By the way, one of the things that it helped is John taught a course at Emory Law School that I had taken on law and medicine, and just like Bill Ferguson had gone back and checked his grade book to see, and I was okay as far as he was concerned. But it was just so lucky in terms of timing that 3.5 years after getting there, I became a partner and the head of the real estate department. And that's purely on luck, timing, right place, right time.
Yeah. But for the rotation system, right?
Oh yeah, I would never have asked to go into the real estate section. But like so many other things, that you get there, and as you learn to do it and get pretty good at it, it's all of a sudden a lot more fun. And interesting thing was when they would have CLE, you're going to have a CLE in Atlanta on real estate. So you say, okay, we need somebody from Alston and somebody from King and Spalding and somebody from Sutherland and whatever. Well, they would get the Pat Pattersons of the world from Sutherland and Travis Brennan and other much more senior folks. And when they got to my firm, they got me. So, you know, there I am, 29, 30, 31, on these CLE programs as if I know what I'm doing. I learned so much from the Pat Pattersons and Travis Brennans and others when you're putting those CLE programs together with these folks who are really good at it. You learn a lot.
I want to ask you, in that same vein, about mentors. I mean, we talk a lot in law school today about mentors, and I wonder if you could talk about who your mentors were as a young lawyer. I know we have mentors throughout our careers, but as a young lawyer, who they were, and what did it mean for them to mentor you? I mean, what exactly was happening?
Well, interestingly enough, the 3 named partners, Alston, Miller, and Gaines, were 3 very different people. Philip was the rainmaker, brought in tons of business. Henry Miller was the scholar. Then I used to use Mr. Miller if I had a tough problem. I'd go in to see him. His nickname, by the way, was Hank the Prank, but not to his face. By the time you got out of his office an hour and a half later, you would have run down every rabbit run that could possibly exist from this set of facts. And you went away comfortable knowing that he'd had a close examination. And Alec Gaines was in the middle. He was the real counselor. He was the kind of lawyer that his clients really wanted as a part of what was going on. And there's an interesting fellow named Ben Kohler, who was with a firm that I think it was called then Smith, Kohler, Ringel, Martin, and Lowe. In any event, why he was a mentor was, I'd been with the firm a fairly short period of time, and all of a sudden, Philip Alston, at that time Mr. Alston, pokes his head in the door and says, "Go home and pack up, we're on our way to New York in the morning." Now the first thing I learned was that the young person on the trip better have enough cash because he was expected to deal with cabs, tips, everything else. The senior partner did not worry about things like that. Second thing I learned, we go to good client, Macy's. Macy's is selling a shopping center. And it turns out Ben Kohler was on the other side. I'm sitting there at the table, just all excited about being able to go off to New York on his first trip. And so we're starting to talk about the shopping center and negotiating the deal. And at that point, I still remember his name, Marvin Finster. General counsel of Macy's sticks his head in and says, "Philip, I need to see you." And I will tell you, Marvin Finster was the lawyer you wanted on your side. He was tough as nails. In any event, Philip says, "You guys keep talking. It's only going to take a minute. I'll be right back."
Now, what was the deal you all were working on?
Selling a shopping center. So it had, at that time, involved a lot of money. I don't even remember now what it is, how much it was. But we kept talking, and we came to something, and Ben Kohler looks across the table and says, "Well, I know you're going to require my client to pay the intangibles tax, so we don't need to spend any time on that. Just go ahead and put that in the document." And of course, I'm sitting there thinking, what is an intangibles tax? Ben Kohler knew I didn't know that. I mean, he could have stuck it to me, but he was a consummate professional. And in any event, it turned out that Philip Alston and Marvin Finster took a lot more time than they thought, and they came back in. They were very apologetic. And Ben looks up and says, "We've got a deal. It's done." And they both were sort of shocked. And they look over at me, and Ben runs through the deal, and Marvin Finster said, "That's what we were looking for. Let's do it." And so, again, I look good because of Ben Kohler. It was a lesson I not only learned, but over 30 years in practice, I had the chance to do the same thing.
Yeah. Well, of course, one of the lessons there is that your mentors, obviously many of them come from your own firm, but
they don't have
they
to.
don't have to. I mean,
Yeah.
they can come from adversaries. You can learn from them and then turn around and do it for somebody else.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, why don't we take our first break, and then we'll come back in about 10 minutes.
Very good.
Okay, thanks.